Ms. Jasmine El Gamal, a foreign affairs analyst and a foreign affairs and a former Middle East advisor at the U.S. Department of Defense, where she served 3 secretaries of defense and closely followed Iran's military posture and political evolution. Jasmine, thank you very much for being with us in today's episode of In Focus. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
We start off with asking you, you've long warned about the politicized use of intelligence in U.S. foreign policy. How do you assess the administration's justification for bombing Iran's nuclear facilities?
Thanks for bringing that up. I think that's a really important point. And when we look at the statements from political leaders, Israeli leaders, and American leaders, and how the intelligence has sort of changed and been shifted to fit those political statements, that to me is a really worrying sign that the intelligence was used to support a decision that had already been made politically. So on the Israeli side, for example, we know that Prime Minister Netanyahu has wanted to bomb Iran and specifically Iran's nuclear program for years. He has been saying for years, decades even, that Iran was on the verge of a nuclear weapon and that it had to be stopped. Various U.S. administrations have sort of ebbed and flowed when it came to that idea. Some administrations were more hawkish, like the Bush administration, for example, and some administrations were less hawkish and wanted to favor diplomacy or preferred diplomacy over war, like Barack Obama, when it came to Iran specifically. And so when you saw how Israel provided or talked about its own intelligence, it talked about it as if this was a very urgent situation. U.S. intelligence did not match that. It did not match the Israeli intelligence until it appeared that Donald Trump had made a decision to strike, and then very quickly you saw the way that U.S. officials started talking about their own intelligence in a different way.
Does mean do you see that when Donald Trump decided to strike suddenly, it was already a plan that was planned upon before the strike?
I don't. I actually really don't. I think that when Donald Trump went into, and by the way, I have to qualify this by saying I'm not a supporter of Donald Trump or his general policies. In fact, I'm very critical of a lot of the stuff that he does and says, especially domestically in the Middle East. But I'm going to talk about it objectively now from an analysis perspective. I think from everything that we had seen Donald Trump say and do in his second term, that he actually was not in favor of going to war. And he is not, even at the moment, is not in favor of starting any new wars, especially in the Middle East. So I think what happened is that you saw Benjamin Netanyahu, who has seen this opportunity as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to strike what he calls the head of the snake. So after Israel sort of kind of decimated Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza, he decided, and he was making the case that now is the perfect time to decapitate the regime in Iran, which he sees as the head of the snake of the whole thing. And so he made the case to Donald Trump. This is something that you have to do now. Israel is in imminent danger, and it's not just Israel that's in danger, it's the US that's in danger and the whole world as well. And you are the only person who can stop it. I think that was the tone of Benjamin Netanyahu's arguments to Donald Trump. And so I think that Donald Trump was finally convinced by that argument. And I think he's a person who thinks according to his ego as well. And when people in his own administration, in his own Republican Party, and the Israeli Prime Minister were telling him, you're the only one who can save us from this, that really had an influence on him. But I do think at the end that in his mind, he saw this as an opportunity not to expand war, but to shock Iran into coming back to the negotiating table.
Okay, do you believe the intelligence claims about the destruction of Iran's enrichment capabilities are credible, or are we seeing another Iraq-style narrative?
Yeah, this is a really good question because There are three narratives here, or four actually. So there's the Israeli narrative, which obviously says that they have set the Iranian nuclear program back by a year, if not years. There's the Iran's own assessment, and what it's saying right now is that there was damage done, although we won't know. We don't know the extent of the damage. On the US side, there are two different narratives. One is the official narrative, the White House narrative, which the Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth repeated at the recent NATO conference. He said that we've done major damage. These bombs did exactly what they were supposed to do. The fourth and final narrative is the initial assessment from the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is the intelligence office inside the Pentagon, and their preliminary assessment, which they said they assess with low confidence, which means they're not absolutely sure. That assessment said that very little damage had been done and that the program was set back by only a matter of about 3 months. But as I said, the Secretary of Defense came out publicly and said that that was not true. So the real question of how much damage has been done, I think, is still very much under question. But I think we can assume that at least some damage has been done.
Okay, Trump announced complete success in hitting Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. Yet leaked reports suggest the damage was partial at the best. What should we make of this gap between rhetoric and reality? And I think this brings us to the same conclusion, or takes us to an answer that you're supposed to be answering, but I think it's all about why did the White House today, Pete Hegseth, why did he come up on the podium and try to say that what's going on, it's not reality, and what happened is that we completely damaged all the nuclear facilities in Iran, in continuing this narrative, and that the leakage that's happening, it's not true. Why are they concerned if, on the other hand, the reality is that he already damaged all nuclear facilities in Iran?
I think this comes to something that you had mentioned earlier, or something that we might talk about, which is the impact on Donald Trump's base. You know, the MAGA, America First base that doesn't want war, that doesn't want to see US resources and personnel used to fight wars outside, or especially to fight wars on behalf of another country. And so I think the Trump administration really wants to make sure that their base knows, and of course, as well as the rest of the world, but really they're talking to their base here when they're trying to say this was not all for nothing. We went in to do damage. We did damage. We set back the program by years and years. They're not going to be able to build a bomb now. We made sure of that. And the damage was so great that now we're going to force Iran to come back to the negotiating table because they have no other cards to play. So that's really the message that they're trying to share with the world, with their base, that the US is strong, that it's in charge, that it knew exactly what it was doing, and that everything that it's doing is going to lead to peace in the Middle East. That's the message that they're trying to convey.
So all the message they're trying to convey now is credibility.
Absolutely, of course.
Okay, how do you interpret the president's public musing about regime change in Iran? Is this serious policy, posturing, or political theater aimed at reshaping the narrative?
Yeah, of course, that's the question on everyone's lips.
Yes, exactly, it is.
We talked earlier about how the Israelis, and particularly this Israeli government, certainly wants to see regime change in Iran. And to tell you the truth, there are a lot of Republicans in the US who also would like to see regime change in Iran. But there's also this, this idea that, we've done this in the past. The US has tried regime change in the past. Look at what happened in Iraq. Look at what happened in Libya. Do we really want to do this again? And so I think, maybe Donald Trump, initially he said, no, we're not after regime change. That would cause chaos, and we don't want chaos in the Middle East. Now, I think that's where his head is at. He likes to be unpredictable and he likes to say things off the top of his head. So, a lot of the times when you look at what he says, you really have to think about a lot of different things. You have to look at the context and his mood and what day it is and what else is happening that day, to try to guess, is this real? Is this something that he's just thinking out loud? Is he just messing with people? But on the issue of regime change, I think the US is well aware. I think especially this administration, again, because it's MAGA, it's America first. They do not want to be mired in any more messes in the Middle East, and they certainly don't want to own any country that devolves into chaos because of forced regime change.
Trump's base has traditionally opposed forever wars. Do you see this airstrike and talk of regime change as a betrayal of the MAGA movement's core foreign policy stance?
Yeah, I think you probably have seen the response from the MAGA base. I mean, they're not happy about it. They definitely, you even had like really big names like Tucker Carlson and Marjorie Taylor Greene, the congresswoman who was one of Trump's biggest supporters, and she's very, very representative of the MAGA base. They were very unhappy about this. People like the former Congressman Matt Gaetz, who was also a big supporter of Trump. But I think that once the US went in and did that strike, and again, because the US narrative is the strike was amazing, it was incredible, we did everything, it was quick, it was easy, it was painless.
We
That,
brokered the peace about a ceasefire.
yeah, it brought about a cease. It's like MAGA doesn't want to get into wars, but they really like the idea of superior American strength. So when he went in and he struck and he did the ceasefire and everything was like appears to be fine right now, MAGA, I think now is coming back. It's okay, we didn't like it, we didn't like the strike, but we see what you're saying. We're not going to war. Everything is fine. Go America, all the strength, all of that stuff. And so I think he's been able to win, or not win them over because I don't think they were ever really going to leave him. They're very, very loyal. But I think he's managed to smooth over any ruffled feathers that might have been there.
You've argued that Iran's size, military capacity, and internal complexities make regime change a dangerous fantasy. What are the key risks of escalation that Washington may be ignoring?
Of course, I mean, Iran is a huge country and it's very opaque in certain ways. This is the Islamic regime that came in after the revolution, the Islamic Revolution led by Ayatollah Khomeini in 1979. It's not a regime, it's not a government system that has been very transparent or open with the international world, the international community. And of course, we can't ignore the role of the Revolutionary Guards, the IRGC, which is a very secretive, shadowy organization that is very much involved in governance at the highest levels and involved in every decision, political and military. So there's a lot we don't know about the regime. And one thing we don't know for certain is that if this regime, which by the way, Iranians are against for the most part, we've seen protests for years now of Iranians saying they don't like what the government is doing. They don't like the fact that the government spends so much money and so much effort on spreading chaos across the Middle East, in Lebanon, in Syria, and in Palestine. So it's not a popular government, but if you were to come and decapitate that government, topple it from the outside with no plan, no preparation, with nothing in place to come after, well, we saw again what happened in Libya and we saw what happened in Iraq. And I think that this would be much worse, just given the sheer size of the country and the fact that it's so connected to other countries in the Middle East.
Plus the population.
I think it's over 90
It's
million.
over 90 million, yeah. How
90,
does this, go ahead, sorry.
no, I think it's 92 million.
Okay. Now, how does this episode compare, in your view, to the path that led the United States into the Iraq War, especially in terms of intelligence manipulation and undefined end games?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we talked about that, about how it is so dangerous. And these are the things that I was thinking, in the run up to the US strike, as I was thinking how familiar this feels between now and back then, the war on Iraq. I mean, we all remember that. I don't know if you remember that, but I was old enough to remember the conversations that were happening, and remember seeing Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell and Donald Rumsfeld going on TV and saying, we have to do this, we have to do this, or else it's going to be awful, and chemical weapons and things like that. So you were hearing a lot of the same types of fear mongering and warnings coming out of both the Israelis and the Americans. And like I said, whenever there is a political decision already made to go to war, then you really start to worry about whether that intelligence is being looked at objectively, or if it's just being used and shifted to support the decision that you've already made.
Okay, Ms. Jasmine, we've seen Trump criticize Netanyahu and express frustration at Israel or with Israel, yet proceed with actions that benefit Israeli strategy. How do you explain this apparent contradiction from your own perspective and point of view?
I think that we have to separate the Prime Minister of Israel from the US-Israel relationship as a bilateral relationship between two states. Prime Minister Netanyahu he's not someone who's liked by a lot of people, and successive US presidents have stated either publicly or privately or in leaked conversations that they don't care for him, that they are very frustrated with him, that they know that he tries to manipulate the US to get what he wants. They know all of that. But the fact is that the US-Israel relationship is a relationship that is long-standing, and US support for Israel, again, state to state, is a bipartisan issue in the US. It's both Democrats and Republicans. That's different also from support for Israeli actions in Gaza and otherwise, because more and more Americans and more congressmen and senators and lawmakers are stepping up to criticize this Israeli government. But again, there's always a difference, and you have to remember this when you look at conversations about the US-Israel relationship. You have to remember that there's a difference between an Israeli government or an Israeli prime minister and the overall relationship between the US and Israel. Which
Okay, Ms. Jasmine, this brings us to another question which is related to Gaza in this context. This war, the 12-day war, quote Trump, which took place suddenly when Israel struck Iran overnight, brings us to Gaza now. What's the impact of this U.S.-Israeli military escalation on Gaza, especially as humanitarian conditions worsen and the ceasefire negotiations stall, while we're moving on in the Middle East to another, a totally different country, and another country where Israel is striking, and Gaza, there are atrocities and genocides that are taking place there, and Gaza is out of any agreements or any deals or any negotiations at this point.
Yeah. Unfortunately, during this whole 12-day war thing, we saw how Gaza was not really being covered in the news anymore, that the Iran issue was a real distraction from what's going on in Gaza
Was
still.
this on purpose? Sorry to interrupt you.
Uh, I think it was a convenient side effect. I don't think Netanyahu went to war just so people can stop talking about Gaza, but I certainly think that it was helpful timing for him, because if you remember, just before the Israeli strike on Iran, the amount of global criticism, even from Israel's closest allies, had reached its maximum since the last 2 years. You had the UK government announcing sanctions on Israeli ministers. You had the EU saying we're going to review our agreement, our trade agreement, basically our association agreement with Israel. You had more and more high-level figures, Piers Morgan, all of these people who previously hadn't spoken so clearly about what was happening in Gaza. You saw them come out. You saw more and more people using the word genocide and really not being afraid to use it anymore. So all of this was happening when Netanyahu decided to strike Iran. And then Gaza was out of the headlines for 12 days, mostly. But the whole time, people were still dying every single day, not just in Gaza, in the West Bank as well. So now that this war with Iran is over and we're talking about a ceasefire, people are asking, so what's going to happen to Gaza now? Is it possible, like you were just asking, is it possible that the ceasefire with Iran and now you have a ceasefire in Lebanon, although it's being violated regularly? Is this going to spill over into a ceasefire in Gaza? We're hearing conflicting reports about this. So the some reports are saying that Hamas is saying that there are negotiations, and then the same reports are saying from Israel, from the Israeli side, that there hasn't been any progress made. And just today, there was an Israeli newspaper that wrote about something that I haven't seen in any other newspaper. And I asked some people that I know, and they said that this doesn't sound right. But this one Israeli newspaper said that now there's going to be a massive ceasefire, normalization with Saudi Arabia, normalization with Syria, and a withdrawal of Israel from Gaza, and so many more things. But these are so far just all reports. We haven't really seen anything to clearly indicate what is going to happen in Gaza. What we do know for sure is that the carnage and the starvation and the death continues on a daily basis.
Finally, with diplomacy at a standstill and the risk of escalation growing, what alternatives remain for the United States to contain Iran's nuclear program without plunging into another long war?
Yeah, so I think the plan is now for the U.S. to bring Iran back to the negotiating table. Now that it's seen that it's shocked it enough to say basically, if you don't come back, you saw what we just did. We're not afraid to do it again. So I think that this will likely, there are two scenarios. Let me just say that. The first scenario is that Iran realizes how much trouble it's in, how weak it is, and it comes back to the negotiating table, at least on the surface, and then behind the scenes tries to reconstitute its nuclear program in secret. The second option, the second scenario, is for Iran to say, we're just going to withdraw from everything. We're going to withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. We're going to withdraw from the IAEA. No inspections allowed, nothing. You are not going to see anything, and we are going to rebuild in secret, but without the component of negotiations. Either way, I think the message that Iran got out of this whole ordeal is that even if it participates in negotiations, that doesn't protect it from being attacked. So if you put yourself in Iran's shoes, what would you do next? You would try to protect yourself as much as you could, either by racing towards a nuclear weapon or some other way that makes sure that you do not get attacked like this again. And that's the thing that worries me moving forward, is that that is the lesson that Iran got out of this. And that is going to try to make sure that doesn't happen to it again in the future.
Confirming what you said, Ms. Jasmine, is that before Israel struck Iran, there was negotiations and there was the sixth round of negotiation, and Iran insisted on its nuclear facilities, and they were negotiating while Israel decided to strike. So this brings us to the conclusion of what you're saying now, plus the attack that took place from Israel suddenly out of nowhere in the middle of negotiations, which makes any country or any person, as you said, in their shoe insecure and have to, of course, there has to be a backlash. I think so. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was just on another program earlier with someone who is someone who's in New York. He's an expert on Iran, and he's of Iranian heritage. And also there was someone from Iran itself who was in the program. And they both were saying the same thing, which I think is very understandable, which is the fact that even the people who in Iran who didn't support and don't support the regime still are so angry at what Israel did because it basically attacked them, as you said, while they were in negotiations, and it caused immense damage. I mean, 500 people died in Iran because of this. You know, many, most of them were civilians. And so you have this effect of rallying around the flag, which is that even if you don't like your own leadership, you're still going to be very protective of your
True.
country because your country was under attack.
True, بس جزمين الجمال for thank you very much for your sharp, sobering analysis. I'm really amazed, and I wouldn't have dreamt for more in today's episode of In Focus. Thank you very much for being with us today, and I'm really, really thankful for you.